Have you ever seen your dog freeze just staring into an empty corner, as if something invisible were there? Have you ever watched your cat hiss at the air, only to find out later something did happen nearby? What if these weren't just instincts? What if your pet wasn't reacting, but perceiving? Now imagine this. In 1943, a woman traveled across 3 states not to save her life, but to save her dog's soul. And what Edgar Cayce, the man called the Sleeping Prophet, told her that day was so disturbing, so impossible, it took humanity 80 years to begin understanding it. He said the animals already know, and they're trying to warn us. If what you've heard so far sparks something inside you, a memory, a feeling, a quiet knowing, stay with us. Because what happened next, in the fall of 1943, may change how you see your pet forever. It was October 1943. The world outside was burning, soldiers fighting in Europe, children hiding in basements, families torn apart by war. But in a quiet room in Virginia Beach, something else was happening. Something the newspapers wouldn't print, but that would ripple through time far more than any battlefield headline. Her name was Margaret Henderson, a woman in her 60s, grey hair tied back, eyes too tired for her age. She had driven across 3 states in the middle of wartime fuel rationing, not for a doctor, not for herself, but for her German shepherd, Duke. He wasn't sick in the traditional sense. There were no wounds, no limps, no infections, but something had changed. He had begun staring at corners of her home as if someone were there, whimpering at nothing, avoiding streets they used to walk down every day. Margaret wasn't a superstitious woman. She had lived through the Great Depression. She believed in work, in common sense, in keeping your feet on the ground. But Duke's behavior frightened her, not because he seemed crazy, but because deep down, she knew he wasn't. And so, she did something unthinkable for a woman of her background. She brought a worn photograph of Duke and went to see Edgar Cayce, the man they called the Sleeping Prophet. Cayce wasn't a showman. He didn't wear robes or speak in riddles. He was quiet, modest, a former photographer and Sunday school teacher. But when he lay on his couch and entered his trance, his words became something else entirely. He had given over 14,000 readings diagnosing diseases, finding missing objects, even describing past lives, all while seemingly unconscious, with his wife and secretary Gladys Davis recording every word. Margaret sat in front of him, trembling slightly as she placed Duke's photograph on his desk. She didn't know what to expect. A blessing, a gentle dismissal, but Cayce lay back, eyes closed, breath deepening, voice shifting into that distant tone his followers knew well. And then he spoke. He said the soul force, the same energy that animates humans, moves through all living things, not metaphorically, not poetically, but truly. The animals, he explained, are not beneath us. They are not simple. They are travelers on parallel paths of consciousness. And while humans have forgotten how to hear the deeper rhythms of the universe, animals have not. Then Cayce said something that would stay with Margaret for the rest of her life. He gestured toward the photograph of Duke, eyes still closed, and said, "Your companion walks between worlds. He sees what you cannot. He listens where you no longer do. And he is not alone." Margaret leaned in, her hands clenched tight in her lap. Cayce continued, saying that thousands upon thousands of animals were being born into this world with heightened sensitivities. They would come as forerunners of a great awakening, guides, teachers, protectors, and warning systems. As the Earth approached massive energetic shifts, these animals would act as early detectors not of weather or politics, but of consciousness itself. What Margaret didn't yet know, what no one did, was that Cayce had just made one of the most profound and controversial prophecies of his lifetime. A prophecy not about war, economics, or politics, but about the very definition of awareness, one that science, decades later, would begin to prove piece by piece, not in spiritual circles, but in laboratories and clinics. But on that day in 1943, all she had was Cayce's voice, and the strange, impossible truth that her beloved dog wasn't just acting strange, he was trying to communicate across worlds, and that realization would change everything. Thank you for staying with us this far. It means a lot, especially in a world that moves fast and rarely pauses for mystery. But if you're still here, maybe a part of you already knows there's more to this life and to the lives that walk beside us. That what Cayce revealed in that quiet room wasn't just about one dog or one woman. It was about all of us and all of them. It was a redefinition, not just of animals, but of consciousness itself. Cayce described something he called the soul force, a kind of living current that flows through all life, not just humans, not just the intelligent species, but every creature, every cell, every breath. In his words, it was a force we had forgotten, but that animals had never stopped feeling. For most of human history, we've looked at animals through a limited lens as instinct-driven beings, guided only by survival. We've seen them as companions, yes, as cute, loyal, sometimes even emotional, but we still placed them beneath us as if intelligence was the only marker of worth, and language the only sign of soul. Cayce shattered that illusion. He said animals are not lesser. They are not behind us on some evolutionary ladder. They are parallel travelers, different forms of consciousness walking side by side with us, just tuned to a frequency we've long stopped hearing. According to Cayce, animals perceive energy shifts, emotional fields, even spiritual transitions. They don't need words. They don't need belief systems. They respond to what is the raw, unfiltered truth of a moment. That's why so many animals know when a storm is coming before the radar does. Why pets sometimes flee a room moments before tragedy strikes. Why dogs have been known to detect cancer in their owners. And cats gather outside hospital rooms before a patient's final breath. To science, these are anomalies. To Cayce, they are reminders. He warned that as the Earth entered a period of rapid energetic transformation, animals would begin behaving in ways we could no longer ignore. They would lead us away from danger, respond to tremors not in the ground, but in consciousness itself. They would become, in his words, our warning system, our teachers, our bridges to dimensions we've closed ourselves off from. And here's the part that many found hardest to accept. Cayce wasn't just talking about individual pets. He was speaking of a wave, a generation of animals being born with heightened sensitivities. He said these souls were not random. They were coming with purpose. They would help humans remember what we lost, not just connection to nature, but connection to the field of consciousness that unites all life. Let's pause and think about that. What if your dog didn't just love you, but chose you? What if your cat isn't just affectionate when you're sad, but feels what you can't express? What if that sudden bark in the night isn't just noise, but an alert from another layer of reality? We've grown so used to treating animals as background figures in our lives. But Cayce urged us to look again, to listen again. Because as he said, they walk between worlds. And when they stare into shadows, when they stop at corners, when they cry without clear reason, they may be perceiving what we can no longer see. In fact, Cayce took it even further. He said that animals would be the first to respond when the great changes begin, not because they're smarter, but because they're still tuned in. And when we finally start noticing their behavior, really paying attention, we may realize they've been trying to tell us something all along. So the question becomes, have they changed, or have we simply forgotten how to understand them? When Cayce said, "The animals are not warning us about the future, they are the future," he wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally, in their behavior, in their silence, in their uncanny timing. They're showing us the path forward, not just for survival, but for reconnection. And if we dare to listen, we might just find that they've kept the door open all this time. And maybe you're still wondering, could this really be true? Could animals actually sense things we can't? Well, let's look at what's been happening in our world. Not in 1943, but right now. In the decades following Cayce's reading, his words were archived, studied by a small circle of spiritual seekers, often dismissed by science as poetic mysticism. But that started to change quietly, not because scientists suddenly believed in prophecy, but because animals around the world began behaving in ways no one could explain. And the evidence didn't come from folklore, it came from hospital records, seismic data, weather patterns, and the unfiltered observations of people who simply paid attention. In 2021, a video from Japan went viral. It showed a house cat pacing frantically, meowing, hiding under furniture, and then bolting out of a room not once, but repeatedly exactly 24 hours before a 6.8 magnitude earthquake struck the region. This wasn't a reaction to aftershocks. The cat behaved this way before any tremors were detected by machines. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. But the owner, who had been reading old Cayce material online, had been documenting the cat's behavior for months. And when the data was overlaid with seismic events, the pattern was undeniable. In South Africa, 2022 brought something even more bizarre. A pod of dolphins off the coast of Cape Town began exhibiting strange, synchronized swimming patterns, forming complex spirals of bubbles never before seen by marine biologists. At first, researchers thought it might be a mating display, but when Dr. Margaret Henderson, a cetacean communication expert, overlaid the bubble patterns with magnetic field data from the region, he made a discovery that sent chills through the scientific community. The dolphins appeared to be mapping electromagnetic anomalies in the ocean. 2 weeks later, those exact regions experienced massive tidal surges that weren't predicted by any weather model. Had the dolphins felt it coming? Meanwhile, across the globe, other animals were beginning to make headlines not in spiritual circles, but in veterinary clinics and hospitals. Dogs were alerting their owners to cancers before any symptoms appeared. In clinical trials, trained dogs identified certain types of cancer with up to 97% accuracy. Cats were gathering in hospital wings hours before patients experienced medical emergencies. In Thailand, elephants began carving new jungle paths that, months later, would be the only safe routes through regions devastated by landslides. In New Zealand, sheep moved to higher ground 3 days before a flood meteorologists hadn't predicted. In New York City, pigeons began avoiding a particular building weeks before its structure failed, a failure even inspectors didn't see coming. One of the most surprising cases came not from a lab, but from a middle school classroom in Seattle. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus Thompson, who had been diagnosed with mild autism, was observing his pet rabbit as part of a school science project. He noticed the rabbit moved differently on certain days, more restless, more alert. But unlike adults, Marcus didn't dismiss it. He recorded it, tracked it, and noticed that his rabbit's behavior correlated with barometric pressure changes 2 to 3 days in advance. When his findings reached Dr. Sarah Chen, a quantum physicist already researching animal perception, she realized something extraordinary. The rabbit wasn't predicting weather. It was perceiving quantum fluctuations in the environment before they collapsed into actual storms. In other words, the rabbit wasn't reacting to physical conditions. It was interacting with potential futures, something human brains are largely filtered from doing. As these stories accumulated, they stopped being anecdotal. Patterns emerged. Animals weren't just reacting. They were sensing the invisible scaffolding of reality, the quantum fields, electromagnetic shifts, consciousness tremors. Cayce had described it in 1943 as a time when animals would become our bridges to the deeper layers of existence. Now, the bridges were building themselves across species, across continents, across every attempt we'd made to ignore them. Perhaps most fascinating of all was the discovery that the animals exhibiting these abilities weren't random. They were often the offspring of animals who had shown similar sensitivities, as if nature itself was breeding for awareness. A kind of evolution, not of muscle or intelligence, but of perception. A generation of souls, just as Cayce had predicted, born into fur, feathers, and pause here to help us remember what we've forgotten. And yet, for all this, mainstream science remained hesitant. The implications were too big, too disruptive. If animals could perceive realities beyond ours, if their awareness tapped into a level of consciousness we've denied, then everything from biology to ethics to our place in the universe would have to be reconsidered. But the stories didn't stop. The data kept coming. And deep down, we knew what Cayce had said was no longer just a prophecy. It was a mirror. The animals had always known. We were the ones who stopped listening. Maria Santos never thought of her dog as special. Luna was loving, bright-eyed, maybe a little quirky, but in the way many dogs are. She liked her routines, walks in the morning, peanut butter treats in the afternoon, naps by the window. But starting in late 2023, Luna began doing something Maria couldn't explain. Every morning, she would take her toys a red ball, a blue chew ring, a stuffed squirrel, and arrange them on the living room rug. At first, Maria thought it was random. Dogs play, dogs scatter, but the patterns began repeating. The toys were always placed in spirals, always with the red ball in the center, and always with exactly 7 objects. It was precise, intentional. Maria's daughter, Anna, was studying linguistics at university. One day during winter break, she noticed the toy arrangement and paused. This isn't just play, she told her mum. This is structure. This is language. Together, they began documenting the patterns, taking photos, logging dates, sketching spatial layouts. They found recurring symbols. Sometimes the arrangement resembled a heart, sometimes an arrow, but the spiral was most frequent and most mysterious. Then, one morning, Luna created the spiral again. This time Maria felt uneasy. Luna seemed restless, alert, almost insistent. 3 days later, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck British Columbia. The epicenter, when the spiral was digitally overlaid on a local map, the red ball always placed at the center of the spiral matched the epicenter's coordinates almost exactly. The odds were astronomical. Maria posted the images and story online, not expecting much. But the video exploded. Millions watched. Thousands commented with stories of their own dogs who barked uncontrollably before car accidents, cats who fled rooms before electrical fires, horses who refused to enter barns later found to have structural faults. But it was Luna's spiral that captured the world's imagination. She hadn't just reacted to an event. She had anticipated it and communicated it. The scientific community was split. Skeptics claimed pattern projection, coincidence, wishful thinking, but others, especially those working at the intersection of neuroscience, animal cognition, and quantum biology, saw something deeper. The arrangements weren't random. The timing wasn't random. And the number 7, that reappeared in Luna's patterns over and over, just as the earthquake had occurred 7 miles from her home. 7 days after a shift in local magnetic field readings, Dr. Sarah Chen, already studying consciousness perception in animals, saw the lunar case as a breakthrough. She began collaborating with linguists, AI analysts, and animal behaviorists. They weren't looking for tricks or training cues. They were analyzing symbolic intention. And what emerged wasn't a full language, but something eerily close, a symbolic system of meaning, shared not through words, but through arrangement, repetition, and emotional resonance. What if animals, like Luna, weren't mimicking language, but expressing in their own native form through space, movement, pattern? What if, instead of forcing them to speak like us, we learn to read the language they already use? Cayce's words echoed louder than ever. When the animals begin to communicate in ways that cannot be denied, humanity will face its greatest choice. For decades, those words had sounded metaphorical. Now they sounded like a clock counting down. Luna's spiral wasn't just a warning. It was a message, and perhaps a final invitation. Because here's the truth, Luna wasn't the only one. Across the world, other animals were showing signs of symbolic intelligence, arranging, anticipating, expressing. A border collie in Scotland, a parrot in Brazil, a herd of elephants in northern Thailand arranging branches in geometric shapes near an active landslide zone. The question was no longer, can animals understand us? The question was, are we finally ready to understand them? If you've ever seen your pet do something that defied explanation, a moment of knowing, of warning, of connection, we'd love to hear it. Sometimes, the smallest stories hold the deepest truths. Drop your story in the comments below. You might help someone else realize they're not imagining it. It's wild, isn't it? A dog arranging toys, a rabbit sensing weather before it happens, a dolphin mapping the ocean like a sentient compass. But if these animals are truly perceiving something we can't, maybe it's time to ask the bigger question, what exactly is consciousness? And what if we've been looking for it in the wrong place all along? For centuries, science has clung to the idea that consciousness lives in the brain, a byproduct of neurons firing, chemicals exchanging, circuits forming. According to this view, you are aware because your brain lights up a certain way. But what if that's not entirely true? What if your brain doesn't create consciousness, but simply receives, and transmits it, like a radio, tuned to a specific frequency, filtering out what it doesn't understand. That's exactly what Cayce implied in 1943, decades before neuroscience even began to entertain such notions. He described consciousness not as a product, but as a field, a fundamental feature of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. The soul force, he called it. And he wasn't alone in this thinking. In recent years, a growing number of physicists, biologists, and philosophers have started to explore a radical idea: consciousness is not in us. We are in it. Dr. Sarah Chen, the quantum physicist who studied Luna's behavior, became one of the key figures pushing this frontier. Through her research into electromagnetic fluctuations, she discovered that animals were responding to shifts in the quantum environment long before those shifts translated into physical events. And the pattern she noticed was chilling the more sensitive the animal, the earlier the reaction. It wasn't just biology. It was something deeper, something beneath biology. The animals were not reacting to physical changes. They were reacting to potentiality's energy fields, quantum vibrations, consciousness ripples. To explain this, Dr. Chen turned to an unlikely source fungi in forests around the world. Scientists have long known that trees communicate through underground fungal networks, a living web known as the mycorrhizal network. But recent quantum analysis revealed something astonishing. These networks don't just transfer nutrients, they process information, they adapt, they remember. In one experiment, fungal filaments restructured themselves in response to environmental stress, then remembered that response weeks later, behaving less like a nutrient pipeline and more like a neural network. But unlike human brains, they weren't contained in a skull. They were everywhere, a living, conscious mesh beneath our feet. It didn't stop there. Chen's team began analyzing brain scans of animals born after 2020, the very time Cayce predicted the shift would begin. What they found was a consistent increase in neural activity associated with electromagnetic perception. Dogs, cats, horses, even certain birds were exhibiting higher levels of coherence in brainwave frequencies often linked to intuition, precognition, and empathy. And it wasn't random. These patterns were most pronounced in animals from regions undergoing rapid climate change, magnetic disturbance, or high emotional tension. It was as if their consciousness was tuning itself not to survive the environment, but to communicate with it. So what does this mean for us? It means that consciousness may not be isolated to the human mind. It may be a field we all swim in, and animals have simply retained their ability to feel the current. It means that while we've evolved toward logic, abstraction, and language, animals have evolved toward presence, perception, and energetic awareness. Cayce warned that humanity's filters, the very things that help us think and analyze, have also blinded us. And now, those filters are beginning to break down. Not because we're regressing, but because the Earth itself is changing. Magnetic fields are shifting. Solar activity is increasing. Our entire planet is becoming more electrically and energetically active, and in doing so, it's dissolving the old barriers between us and the deeper consciousness we forgot. The animals are responding first, as they always have. But this time, it's not just for their survival. It's a call to us, a call to remember what we once knew, a call to reconnect not just with nature, but with the conscious universe that flows through every root, every wing, every pore. Because if consciousness is everywhere, then nothing is ever truly alone. You might be thinking, all of this is fascinating, even beautiful, but does it really matter? Is it really happening on a global scale? The answer came, quietly but undeniably, on one night when the world fell silent. It was New Year's Eve, 2024. Fireworks were set to explode. Cities were counting down. Millions of people had gathered to celebrate the turning of time. But just as the final minutes approached midnight, something happened, not in one place, but everywhere. Across 6 continents, in rural farms and crowded cities, in forests, oceans, and living rooms, animals stopped. Dogs that had been barking suddenly sat still. Birds that were chirping fell silent. Cats, normally restless during loud celebrations, paused and stared not at anything in particular, but at something unseen, as if listening. Dolphins swam in perfect silence. Whales ceased their songs. For exactly 60 seconds, the natural world went quiet. And millions of people noticed. They didn't understand it. They couldn't explain it. But across social media, across personal journals and quiet conversations, one shared experience kept surfacing, a sense of connection, a momentary awareness that they were part of something vast, ancient, alive, a stillness, not of emptiness, but of presence. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was reverence. A collective pause that felt orchestrated not by humans, but by something beyond them. In that silence, many reported feeling watched not in a threatening way, but in a way that said, "You're not alone." For those 60 seconds, something passed through the veil between species, between worlds. And when it was over, nothing visible had changed. But for those who felt it, everything had. Cayce had spoken of this long ago, a moment when the animals would act not just as messengers, but as instruments of alignment. A moment when the illusion of separation between humans and nature would dissolve, if only briefly. And now, that moment had come not with trumpets or disasters, but with stillness. It was not a warning, it was a gift. A chance to remember that we are not observers of life, but participants in a vast conscious web of being. And the animals, they had been holding that awareness for us all along. Maybe you felt it too in your own home, with your own pet. That moment when they looked at you like they knew something. Maybe you brushed it off. Maybe you wondered, but maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for you to remember. Edgar Cayce never said animals would become psychic. He said they already were and always had been. It was humanity who forgot how to hear. We drowned out the frequencies they never stopped tuning into. We built cities, systems, and stories that placed us above them. And now, they're quietly asking us to come back down, to listen, to notice, to feel again. Because the prophecy isn't about dogs or dolphins. It's about us. About whether we're ready to expand our definition of consciousness beyond what we can measure, beyond what we can monetize. It's about recognizing that life isn't a hierarchy, it's a harmony. And every creature is a note in the symphony we've been too distracted to hear, Cayce said. They are not warning us about the future. They are the future. And now, standing at the edge of a world that feels uncertain and unstable, maybe that's the truth we need most. That the future doesn't have to be something we fear if we're willing to walk into it not alone, but alongside the ones who never left us. They've been waiting, Not for science, not for proof, just for us, to remember how to listen.